and welcome back to my workshop. My name is Paul Hopewell. This video is the concluding part of my South Bend 13 lathe series, which also includes the completion of part 10. In the first video of this series I showed you the lathe as it was when it was unceremoniously plonked on my machine shop floor. To see some of the separate repair processes, be sure to see the videos part 1 to part 10 if you haven't already seen them. As you can see, headings of titles are shown, indicating previous video titles at roughly relative points along this video. This video is really a snapshot of the rebuild process and is in no way the full build. Now let's get on with shoving a bunch of stuff together. I'm going to start with the headstock. It's already mounted on the main slide and I'm about to start with the main bearing lubrication felts. To stop the felt pads from doing as they please, I made 2 wire pins and 1 hook. The hook was made to help me grab the lower part of the felt wick, laying it down along the oilway portal. Both wicks had full and free movement. Because of this, the 2 pins were needed to prevent the felts from getting in the way when the main spindle is finally laid back in place. These little clips are vital components. They sit in the oil return ports and trap small stray bits of swarf entering the oil chamber. As with most of my videos, some of the sequences are sped up on this video, like the rebuild of this main spindle back gear. What you see here is the locking mechanism being thrown together. Although it isn't shown, like so many things on this video, the back gear was pressed back into place. The belt-driven cone plopped over the main spindle, and because the bearings were still in good order, it needed a little push to get them home. The rear thrust bearing was also a good fit, proved by resisting my efforts to get it back into place without a fight. Needless to say, I won. Spindle oil was liberally daubed all over the main spindle bearing faces, as well as the spindle itself. I gave the spindle a spin to see if there was any drag or scratch marks appearing on the journals. Happy with that, I pulled the felt retaining pins out. The next job was to fit the bearing caps, and the shims that came off during the strip down went back as they came off, except they'd been cleaned first. As you'd expect, I doused the bearing journals and caps with spindle oil. This also helps to wash out any impurities with the oil as the caps are bolted down using my Mark I torque wrench. The spindle may need reshimming, but for now it's spinning freely. Next up is the fibre shim and the 2 split locking nuts. They simply whiz on and provide a little thrust acting against the thrust bearing fitted to the main spindle earlier, then lock together with a little tap. Refitting the spindle gear was done with the drift and mallet to a predetermined position. It was done using a split collar that I made to pull the gear off with. This split collar sat behind the gear, and with the aid of a bong to protect the end of the spindle, a 3-leg puller easily pulled the gear off enough to get the puller legs behind the gear without damaging anything else. This split collar was used as the resetting gauge. Fitting the back gear into place was a simple affair. The large spindle gear, of course, was left unlocked for this procedure. Needless to say, I still needed 3 hands to get it together. The belt cover had to be put on first for the 2 screws to be set and locked in place. I know this because I had to take both gear covers back off. And here I am putting the covers back on. Mind you, while running these screws back in, I had another thought about the tops of these bearing caps, and maybe I might put a Rustinox style oiler on the top of each one, but that's for another date. Both oil reservoir fillers were refitted using PTFE tape on the threads, and I used loads of oil when I filled them. When I got this machine, it was fitted with a rubber belt held together with a metal plate that annoyingly clacked over the pulleys. So I refitted the old leather belt that had been softened in a vat of leather softener. One modification I made to this machine was to make and fit a finger guard over the front gear cover. I need it because usually while I'm waiting for a long cut to complete, I habitually rest one hand on the machine headstock. Without a guard, my fingers or hand would very quickly end up as mincemeat. Mind you, I have got a nice set of chucks to go with this machine. I'm sure they'll all come in very useful. You ain't going to believe the state of the gearbox. It was like new. A bit mucky perhaps, but what the hell. All I did was flush it out with diesel and oiled it. I took the feed screw and the gear selector off for better access, and that's all. Mind you, getting this idler gear back into place is a bit of a handful. It was like handling a plastic bag full of frogs. Refitting the idler shaft was a quite straightforward job. I lathered the individual components with gear oil and shoved it all together. The selector plate was only taken off for cleaning, and getting it back together was a simple process the second time, when I remembered to put the selector arm in one of the selector gear pinholes and not waggling around in space. Fitting the 3-position selector in place looked like an easy task, but it very quickly became a throw it down the workshop after dropping the oily retaining bolt under a hard to reach place 3 times. I didn't show it because the last time I dropped the bolt I dropped the gearbox as well, and knocked the top plate flying. I managed to catch the gearbox. The following day I fitted the gearbox onto the lathe with all the dexterity of a drunken ballroom dancer with gout. I had to leave the lead screw end support block loose at the far end of the lathe so as not to damage the lead screw while doing battle with 3 fastening screws at the opposite end of the lathe. It meant that getting the lead screw to line up with a floppy support block was at best, well, challenging. That's better. All water under the bridge now. While the apron was disassembled, I took the time to drill out an oil port to assist with lubricating the hand wheel spindle. Another thing that had to be addressed was the missing caps over the other oil ports. For this, I used bicycle oilers because they were a firm fit in the original oil tubes and oilways. You might be asking, why am I holding a bunch of cheese strings? Well, these cheese strings are felt wicks that I filched from the lining out of one of my wife's oven mitts. Okay, it's not technically felt, but it had all the properties of a felt wick, and after cutting the mitts into several strips I might as well use it. After all, it's too late now. Reassembling the apron gearing was quite straightforward. There's only about 7 gears in there, and after putting all but one back in before having to strip the entire lot out again, twice. Look, I didn't have a manual at the time, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I make no apologies, by the way, for speeding up parts of these videos because they can be a bit boring if I don't. This bit of the apron is the shuttle lock. It's a device that blocks access to one part of the screw feed cutting system from the other thread cutting system. There would be a pretty big bang if both screw feed systems were turned on at the same time if it wasn't there. After fitting the worm feed screw and the key, the clutch cover was fitted with a gasket made from some gasket material that I had hanging around. It's now time to fit the half nuts, but not before I had to remove a little off the corner of the repair to allow me to fit a gib strip bolt. Oops. Back to needing a couple of pairs of hands. Well, if it doesn't work, it'll make a smashing nutcracker. To get the apron to fit, I've got to roll out a bit of forethought because this next bit was a bit fiddly and heavy. First thing I did was to put the main saddle on the slideway, then I put a support underneath the feed screw before removing the feed screw support block. The apron was fed over the end of the feed screw when the key in the worm drive was aligned with the slot on the feed screw. While supporting the whole lot, I slid the saddle over the apron and then shoved the screws in as fast as I could. Trust me, in reality it was easier to say than to do. The change gear set have all seen better days, to be fair, and I reckon I'm going to have to replace all of them. Looking at them, they're going to be quite noisy, but so long as they function for now, that'll do. I've also turned the oil holes in the reversing gears the right way up and removed a bit of muck out of them. At least the oil can get to the bearings now. In this section I fitted the back saddle retaining plate to finally stop the saddle from wobbling about. I've put it on now knowing that it doesn't have to come off again. That feels so much better. While I was about it, I decided to put a couple more loose bits on that were just laying around. I've just received a sticker from Kev of Mr. Factotum's workshop. Kev is a model engineer and like me, he's a motorcycle fan. His channel also includes a variety of topics that I'm sure you'll find very interesting. Give his channel a visit. Welcome to the board, Kev. Cheers. This is how I left the crossfeed nut in part 10. I did this so that I could tie it in with this video, and I'll explain very soon why I built the nut like I did. In part 9 I also repaired the crossfeed screw, so both cross-slide feed components have much less backlash in them. But that doesn't mean that the worst cross-slide backlash offender has been addressed, not by a long chalk. The cross-slide nut was extended to give as much longitudinal support by both the underside of the cross-slide plate and along the cross-slide screw. I've mentioned there's another offender causing excess backlash, and that is the relationship between the screw, this bush, the graduated collar and the crank handle. While I was in the process of making the extended nut, I had to take into consideration that the screw stops short in the cast slot. The underside of the nut has this step in it to reach beyond the end of the thread. The nut would touch the end of the slot at the same time as the end of the screw. With the nut set in place, you can see that there is already 50% more of the nut resting directly on the underside of the cross-slide face. You can also see that the extension and the spacer both hang out of the back of the cross-slide in mid-air. I did say when I made the screw that it's about 1 inch longer than the original. The reason for this will soon become very apparent. I wound the cross slide on a bit just so that I could set and tighten the nut into place. I further wound on the cross slide to its extreme to test my theory with the nut and slot collision. All's well in that department. Fitting the graduated collar and the crank handle revealed the next backlash error. Rotationally, I was still getting almost 1/2 of a revolution before the backlash was taken up. The crank retaining nut was nipped up so that I could establish the best way of eliminating this error. The quickest solution would be to fit a spacer between the graduated collar and the bush, but that would create difficulties when trying to line up the graduations. So fitting a spacer between the graduation collar and the hand crank was the only option. The feeler gauge helped establish how bad the error was. 1.17 millimeters, that's a lot. What I did was machine this shoulder in by 1.15mm to here. Then I fitted a 1.15mm thick spacer to prevent any issue here. Naturally, I took the screw out of the south bend and put it in the Walco. After dusting the appropriate face, I withdrew the cutter and took 2 swipes at 0.57mm deep. That's about 22.5 thou. That should be enough to leave a minuscule amount of backlash, and then, after making the 1.15mm spacer, the graduation collar should still have enough room to allow any indexing I require. Here you can see what I mean about the little recess in the hand crank. This little nut doesn't have much room as it is, and that's why I chose to leave it well alone. This time I made sure that this little nut was well torqued up. Now the cross-slide gib was fitted and screwed into place, but not fully set just yet. I'd like to set the gib strip after I've run everything back and forth a few times. After oiling the feed screw, I plugged up the countersunk oil hole with a shortened screw. Sometime in the future it's necessary to adjust the cross-slide nut. It's a simple matter of unscrew the rear cover, then unscrew the cap head screws and remove them, then wind the crossfeed screw until the back end of the crossfeed nut and the shim drop into your hand. Then polish a bit off the shim thickness. Reverse the operation to put it all back together. This process will reduce the backlash or make it very tight if you remove too much off the shim. Putting the compound slide back in place is a really easy job. There are 2 sliders that lock against the dovetailed underside of the compound slide, and these 2 sliders are in turn driven by 2 easily accessible screws. This is a much better system than the one on my Walco lathe. Initially, to get this tool post T-nut off the compound slide took many hammer swings and a great deal of sweat. What came out was this dirty great big T-nut and about half a ton of rust, and a couple of chips. Even after cleaning both parts to this eventual marriage, they still refused to engage without a fight. To find out where the problem was, I coated the T-nut with marking glue and then tried to assemble the 2 parts together once more. After I'd recovered the T-nut, I found that a very small area on the underside was bruised. 2 seconds with a linisher eradicated the need to bang it back into place with Thor's mallet. The tool post has 1 damaged screw hole, but that's not really a problem, and the other missing item is a proper handle for the top locking lever. Again, not a problem right now. It feels nice and sturdy though. The tailstock is almost as heavy as the headstock, made from girders I shouldn't wonder. That aside, it's received the least amount of attention, aside that of a lick of paint and the removal of a packing strip. I bet you thought I wouldn't have a spanner big enough for this. The packing strip under the tailstock body was presumably to allow for the original wear on the slides. Now, with there being very little deviation on the slides, the packing strip is no longer required. The tailstock screw, spindle and hand wheel all received a modicum of maintenance and some paint. It would have been nice if it had been the same all over. Still, it's done now. Well, almost. Finally, I get to fit the 4 slide protection felts. These are the original ones. The only maintenance here was to clean the brass covers. Now to give the whole machine a good wipe down and a bit of a dust. Forgot about that.
Many hours later.
I wired this machine up myself. I've got electrical experience, and a while ago I used to hold a NICEC electrical certificate of competence. With that in mind, I'm keeping the wiring system to myself because electric is invisible and dangerous. That's all for this series. I do hope you enjoyed your journey as much as I enjoyed your many comments. Until next time, bye for now.